Okay, welcome back to yet another fun-filled episode of Intellectual Property Law. Today we're going to be talking about the concept of dilution, right? So this is another trademark doctrine that's related or similar to trademark infringement, but different in really important ways. So when we've talked about trademark infringement, we've recognized that the key question when it comes to trademark infringement is consumer confusion. When a mark is substantially similar to a existing mark in such a way that it creates the risk of confusing consumers about the source of a product or service. So normally, in order for a mark owner to make out a claim of infringement, they have to prove consumer confusion. They have to prove that the marks are likely or actually do cause consumers to misunderstand where a product is coming from. Now, dilution is different, and various versions of a dilution claim have existed in state law for a long time, but were only adopted into federal law in the 1990s and then revised in the early 2000s, creating a new cause of action for a certain subset of trademark owners on the basis of what's known as either blurring or tarnishment. And essentially, what dilution allows trademark owners to do, certain trademark owners to do, is to bring a cause of action against someone who's using a mark that's similar to their mark, but not necessarily confusing, right? But nonetheless harming their mark, harming the distinctiveness of their mark in some way. So in other words, dilution is related to trademark infringement, but different insofar as it doesn't require consumer confusion. It just requires harm to the senior mark. It requires reduction in the distinctiveness of the senior mark. And it can happen in two different ways, right? One is by blurring, which is essentially causing additional associations with the mark that wouldn't have previously existed in such a way that they reduce the distinctiveness. They reduce the communicative value of the senior mark to consumers. And the other is by tarnishment, by creating negative associations with the senior mark. In other words, kind of making it look bad or criticizing it in some improper way. Now, there's certain limitations on the scope of the dilution action, the most important of which is that dilution is only available to owners of famous marks. We're going to talk about that in our next class, but at the end of the day, what famous means is really, really famous. In other words, everyone across the entire country has to be familiar with the mark in question, right? The overwhelming majority of people have to understand what the mark is and what the mark signifies. And if they don't, then the mark is famous. As some people like to say, if you have to ask yourself whether it's famous, it's probably not famous, right? I mean, what's a famous mark? Coca-Cola is a famous mark. McDonald's is a famous mark. Starbucks maybe is a famous mark now as well. Okay, so famousness is really critical, but there are also concerns about, the nature of the cause of action. After all, if consumers aren't actually confused by the alleged diluting use of a junior mark, should there be a cause of action in the first place? After all, I mean, if this is all about protecting consumers, then why do we care if it impairs the distinctiveness of the senior mark? Too bad, so sad. Consumers aren't confused. Not a problem, right? Well, arguably, consumers do have some investment in the strength of marks as well. In other words, consumers value the marks. Consumers are invested in the goodwill of the marks. And part of the idea behind the concept of dilution is that maintaining the strength of really famous, really important marks is valuable to consumers as well as the mark owners, at least arguably. So we can ask ourselves to what extent we think that's actually true. And we can ask ourselves to what extent blurring and tarnishment are actually a real thing in the first place. In any case, what does an action for blurring or tarnishment allow a trademark owner to do? Well, among other things, they can ask for an injunction. They can stop the junior user from continuing to use the diluting mark. And what do they have to show in order to do that? Well, they have to show famousness, right? In other words, it has to be really, really famous. And in order to show blurring, there's a whole set of factors. We'll talk about those blurring factors in relation to the Starbucks Charbucks case in just a moment. Essentially, what courts are asked to do is to ask, well, just how famous is the mark, the senior mark in question, and what's the relationship and the intention of the junior users' use? In other words, what are they trying to accomplish by virtue of the use of this junior mark, and what kinds of experiences or what kinds of associations is the allegedly blurring use actually causing in consumers? But by contrast, when it comes to tarnishment, really the concern with tarnishment is just any kind of use of a similar but not necessarily confusing mark that harms the reputation of the senior famous mark. Okay. Now, of course, there are certain exceptions to blurring and tarnishment, right? Fair use, right? Comparative advertising, parody, any kind of commentary, non-commercial uses. In other words, there's an obvious concern here when it came to the creation of a dilution statute around the idea that, allowing causes of action for blurring and tarnishment implicate problems with expressive values in a way that's even stronger than regular trademark infringement actions, right? When it comes to trademark infringement, we're talking about commercial speech, we're talking about communicating commercial information. When it comes to blurring, we're already kind of getting into expressive values and the meaning of marks, right? So we can see how this starts to implicate free speech related concerns. And when it comes to tarnishment, well, tarnishment goes directly to harming the reputation. Criticism is a really key First Amendment value. We can see how a cause of action for tarnishment might raise First Amendment concerns that we would want to address. And we can think about that in the context of the Starbucks Charbucks case as well. So what happened there? Well, obviously, Starbucks, the iconic, originally Seattle-based coffee shop chain, has now become an iconic brand across the United States and the world. Everyone recognizes the Starbucks logo. If anything is famous at this day and age, definitely Starbucks, right? So famousness not a problem for the purpose of Starbucks bringing a dilution action, right? The question is whether the Black Bear Micro Roastery Charbucks blend, which you can see here, this is the one that started the lawsuit. It says here on the bag that I have here at home. Okay, so the question is whether there is dilution by virtue of their use of the phrase Charbucks blend. Okay, so what's the problem here? Starbucks can't bring a trademark infringement action because there's no evidence that consumers are confused, right? I mean, we can look at the use of the words in context. They're not actually using the word Starbucks in the first place. And the totality of the label that is allegedly infringing on the Starbucks brand is in context so different from anything that Starbucks would produce and so clearly not indicating that the source of the product is Starbucks that a trademark infringement action was dead in arrival. But Starbucks was trying to pursue a dilution action here on both blurring and tarnishment grounds. And there was a lot of back and forth in the lower court, essentially between the lower court and the Second Circuit, essentially over what a plaintiff in a dilution action actually has to show, right? So initially the Second Circuit reversed the lower court on the ground, essentially that the lower court was expecting Starbucks to prove a risk of confusion, to prove substantial similarity. And the court said, no, essentially the whole point of a dilution action is to allow trademark owners, to famous owners of famous marks, to bring an action that doesn't require them to satisfy the criteria for a traditional infringement action. In other words, dilution is more expansive. It covers more than than a trademark infringement action does, and it allows the owner of a famous mark to bring an action against the user of a junior mark who's evoking the famous mark without necessarily being confusing, right? So the court looks at the 6 different factors provided and sort of gives a pass to Starbucks on the second, third, and fourth one, insofar as basically anyone who would qualify for a dilution action in the first place, anyone who owns a famous mark, 2, 3, and 4 are likely to be true in the first place. I mean, if it doesn't have an awful lot of inherent or acquired distinctiveness, it's not going to be a famous mark in the first place, right? If it's not being substantially exclusively used, well, then again, it's probably not a famous mark in the first place. And if people don't recognize it, that's what the whole thing, that's what it means for it to be a famous mark in the first place. So these factors don't seem terribly helpful when it comes to doing the analysis of dilution, but it does look to the degree of similarity, right? And the lower court says, look, degree of similarity, that must mean substantial similarity. The Second Circuit says no, right? Degree of similarity simply means you should look at how similar they are in doing the dilution analysis. You don't actually have to show substantial similarity because that's about confusion. We're not talking about confusion. We're talking about the similarity of the marks in question. It says, well, Starbucks, Charbucks, not that similar, but, arguably, possibly, maybe, right? And then it looks at the intentions and actual associations. The lower court initially says, look, Starbucks just hasn't produced any meaningful evidence that there's actual meaningful associations between Starbucks and Charbucks. The Second Circuit initially says, look, you have to go back and analyze this differently. You have to go back and analyze this in terms of not are people going to be confused, but is there a likelihood of blurring of the meaning of the mark, right? And ultimately the lower court says, look, under the circumstances, no, right? On review, it says, no, we don't think blurring of the mark is likely because consumers can tell the difference, right? And all Charbucks is really doing is commenting on Starbucks as a cultural institution, right? In effect, one gets the impression the lower court is essentially saying there's an awful lot of speech-related values implicated here. Starbucks carries a lot of meaning, and it would be a problem to prevent other coffee roasters, especially small mom and pop ones in rural New Hampshire, from engaging in speech that commented on Starbucks, the cultural coffee phenomenon. In addition, Starbucks was pursuing a tarnishment claim that really didn't go anywhere, right? Because the Second Circuit said, well, to the extent that Charbucks could be taken as a criticism of Starbucks, it could also be taken as saying, like, our blend is super duper ultra burnt roasted and Starbucks maybe is less so. And, really the point here is maybe some people like it dark. If you like a dark roast coffee, then this isn't a criticism. And there's nothing about the use of the term Charbucks blend that tarnishes or reduces the positive associations that consumers have with Starbucks. So really one thing this case starts to illustrate is sort of what are we trying to accomplish, if anything, with dilution actions in the first place? Should we have dilution actions for owners of famous marks, or should we expect anyone bringing an action of these kinds to actually prove consumer confusion? Is dilution a problem, and does it implicate First Amendment values in a way that we should be concerned about?